Pearl's awareness snapped back into her body, the connection severed as the lightning and her essence were swallowed whole by the desolation. One heartbeat she had been brushing against that vast, sleeping reservoir of life far below. The next, there was nothing but the shallow pool around her and the hollow silence beneath the great tree. She inhaled sharply. Her channels burned as if scoured raw. Every pathway that had carried her essence moments before now felt frayed and tender. And her core was nearly empty. A thin, wavering glow remained deep within her abdomen, but it was a shadow of what it had been. She had been so close. The desolate ash between her and the hidden well of life had devoured the final wisps of lightning before she could complete the connection. Pearl clenched her hands against her knees. Now that she knew the truth, she could not stop. The desolation was just a barrier. Beneath it lay a severed piece of the great tree itself. A dormant root, sealed away for cycles beyond counting. She only needed one more strike. One more opportunity to drive lightning and her essence through that final stretch of lifeless ash. She waited. Her breathing slowed and she felt the ache in her channels. A sliver of her awareness remained fixed upward, attuned to the storm root above. But the air remained still. No pressure built. No layered tones of gathering lightning essence. The storm root hung silent. A thin thread of unease tightened in her chest. Was that the last bolt? Had she squandered her only chance? Her thoughts flickered briefly to Cade. Whatever reckless method he had devised to restore the storm root before, she could only hope he would attempt it again. She needed only one more cycle. One more surge of lightning powerful enough to break the seal. But that was beyond her control. The only thing she could command right now was herself. Pearl exhaled slowly and turned inward. Her channels were in worse condition than she had realized. The inner pathways that carried her essence felt scraped thin, overextended by the strain of merging with the storm. Even now they throbbed faintly, like overworked muscles trembling after exertion. And her core? She shifted her focus fully to it. Deep within her abdomen, she envisioned the small sphere of golden light that defined her path. In her mind's eye, it floated steady and luminous though its glow had dimmed considerably. It was almost perfect. Almost. Small tarnished patches marred its surface, dull imperfections interrupting the otherwise radiant sphere. Those flaws represented her incomplete harmony with the progenitor's three paths. She had wanted to polish them. Refine them. Perfect her foundation before undertaking these trials. But Second Elder Verosk had sent her anyway. If her core had been flawless, would she have pierced the barrier in a single attempt? Would she have reached the dormant root without needing another bolt? Perhaps. But speculation would not restore her essence. This was her reality. An imperfect core. Ragged channels. And a nearly depleted reserve of power. Gently, she wrapped her awareness around her core, not squeezing it this time, not demanding more but cradling it. Coaxing it. Push through, she urged silently. Just a little more. She felt the faintest pulse in response, a slow, stubborn regeneration of essence. Not enough to attempt another call, but it was something. Then, a tingling brushed across the top of her head. Pearl's eyes snapped open. Lightning essence gathered above her. Faintly at first, then stronger as layered tones began building once more in the air around the storm root. Her heart surged with fierce relief. Cade. Whatever he was doing, he had done it again. The pressure mounted overhead, multicolored harmonics weaving together as the storm root began to glow. Pearl straightened in the shallow pool, exhaustion forgotten. This would be the strike and she would not waste it. She didn't care how tired she felt or how drained her core was, she would give this next attempt everything she had. Pearl did not hesitate. She seized her core and squeezed. Every remaining drop of essence was forced outward. Her golden sphere flared painfully bright as she compressed it beyond comfort, beyond caution. Essence tore through her channels in a blazing rush. Her pathways had only just begun to mend and were forced open again, stretched to their limits as power flooded through them. The pain was sharp and immediate. She welcomed it. This time she knew what she was reaching for. Pearl did not attempt to separate the 5 colors. She did not fracture her awareness into individual harmonics. She gathered everything into one. Her throat vibrated with a single, piercing tone, an all-encompassing note that resonated with every layer of lightning essence gathering above. One perfect storm of transformation. The storm root blazed. The multicolored bolt began to form and Pearl thrust her essence upward before it could fall. Her essence burst from her throat and enveloped the storm root completely, meeting the lightning at its source. The connection locked instantly. Lightning answered her call with a force that stole her breath. The density of this bolt dwarfed the previous ones. Whatever Cade had done, it had fed the crucible beyond anything she had felt before. This was a torrent, and as the bolt fell, Pearl's consciousness fell with it. Her essence fused seamlessly with the descending lightning, intertwining so completely she could no longer distinguish between her own essence and the storm's. Together, they drove downward through the pool, water erupting around her. The compacted ash beneath did not stand a chance. Together they bored through it. Layer after layer of lifeless compression shattered under the unified force. The desolation attempted to devour the lightning as before, but this time the power was too concentrated, too vast. It did not dissipate. It carved a path deeper and deeper. Pearl followed, her consciousness riding the spear of multicolored brilliance as it plunged through meters of suffocating ash. And then the barrier ruptured as her essence collided with the immense reservoir below. It was unmistakable. Ancient. Vast. Saturated with life essence so dense it hummed like a second sun beneath the earth. It bore the unmistakable signature of the great tree itself, its rhythm, its harmony. A severed root. Not dead but dormant from many cycles of being disconnected to the great tree's trunk. Pearl's awareness trembled at the scale of it. This was no minor offshoot. This was a pillar of the great tree, long buried beneath deliberate layers of desolation. Why had it been sealed? There was no time to question. Above, her body moved without conscious thought. Lightning rained down around her, but she no longer sat rigid in meditation. Guided by instinct older than memory, she bowed forward. Her lips broke the surface of the water. And she breathed out. Even though her core was drained dry, a thin thread of the purest life essence she had ever felt flowed from her mouth into the pool. It followed the lightning's carved path downward, guided by the channel she and the storm had just created. She felt it descend. Felt it touch the dormant reservoir. The moment her essence connected, the world exploded around her. Life essence surged upward in a violent eruption. Ancient power awakened and rushed along the pathway she had opened. Explosive growth began instantly. Pearl's consciousness was hurled back into her body as the ground beneath her trembled. The pool churned violently. The hollow under the great tree filled with a deep, resonant rumble that was not thunder. It was something far older. Pearl gasped, hands bracing against the ground as the earth shook around her. She did not know exactly what she had done. Only that she had succeeded. She had connected the sealed route to the great tree once more. High above the hollow, inside the cramped darkness of the storm sap crucible's chamber, Cade knelt with both hands above the wooden bowl. Blood trickled from his palm, his wound closing as his reforged body worked to heal the laceration. Multiple rounds of lightning had already thundered downward. Was that enough? He had no idea. There hadn't been a triumphant shout or system notification telling him Pearl was done. He gritted his teeth and tried to pull more blood into his cupped hands, but the flow had slowed. His reforged body was already clotting the wounds. The cut was knitting together before his eyes. Without sap from the great tree or his blood, the crucible would remain dark. And he had no way of knowing whether Pearl needed one more strike or 10. Maybe it needs more of my blood. He grabbed the spear again and slashed the healing wound. It split open easily under the blade. He hissed through his teeth, but he wasn't finished. He then grabbed the spear with his wounded hand and pressed the blade into his other palm, carving a matching gash. Blood welled up instantly in both of his hands, thick and dark in the crucible's fading glow. He held both hands above the bowl, letting the blood pool in his palms before spilling downward. The channels below flared in response, faint at first. He hesitated. If it truly needs more blood, what would happen if I made direct contact? He had purged the corruption from the crucible. Faced down the will of an entity even the system had redacted. If there was anyone who could connect to it safely and come out of it fine, it was him. Only one way to find out. He lowered his hands. More blood splashed into the bowl at the same instant his torn palms pressed flat against the inner surface. The reaction was immediate. The crucible seized him. It felt like a powerful suction locked onto his wounds and yanked. Blood surged out of his veins in a violent rush. Shit! He tried to jerk back, but his hands wouldn't move. It was as if the bowl had fused to his skin. The channels along the crucible exploded with light. Red, orange, yellow, green, and blue blazed downward in blinding intensity. Faster and brighter than ever before. Brighter than anything he'd seen yet. Cade swore as dizziness washed over him. His vision swam. He could feel the volume of blood leaving his body too much, Too fast. This was a bad idea, he thought hazily. Below, thunder roared louder than any of the previous strikes. The sound shook the chamber walls. It's working. I just need to hold on. The channels pulsed, pouring energy downward in a sustained torrent. Not a single bolt. A flood. His heartbeat thudded in his ears as the crucible continued to drink from him. He braced his knees against the wooden floor and pulled again, straining to rip his hands free, but they didn't budge. His skin felt fused to the bowl and the suction intensified for one terrifying moment more. Then suddenly stopped. The flow of blood ceased. Warmth crept back into his arms, though his head still spun from the loss. The crucible remained fully lit, every channel blazing with multicolored brilliance. But now it wasn't pulling from him. It was channeling something else. The chamber began to tremble. At first Cade thought it was thunder echoing upward. Then the tremors deepened. The wooden walls groaned. The entire chamber shuddered as if something massive were shifting within the great tree itself. What the hell is going on? The rumbling deepened. It was not the sharp crack of thunder, but a grinding, shifting force like roots tearing through stone or the earth itself being rearranged. The chamber shook violently, knocking Cade forward, but his palms remained stuck to the inner curve of the crucible's bowl. Come on, he hissed, trying again to wrench himself free. The crucible remained lit, every channel blazing with multicolored brilliance. The curved wooden walls of the chamber groaned, fibers stretching and compressing. In the blazing light of the crucible, Cade saw something that made his stomach drop. The walls were moving. Growing. The wood rippled inward and then outward again, like muscle flexing beneath bark. The entire chamber felt alive in a way it hadn't before. Warmth pulsed from the bowl into his palms. An itch began at the point of contact, deep as if it were under his skin. It spread across his palms and down into his wrists. He tried again to pull away, panic rising sharp and hot in his chest. They wouldn't move. The itching intensified, turning into a prickling burn. Then into fire. Cade sucked in a sharp breath as searing pain lanced up both arms. It felt like splinters were being driven into his flesh from the inside out. Stop, he growled through clenched teeth. He reached inward on instinct, flexing his will and activating hyper-focused meditation. His mind raced as the world around him seemed to slow. The rumbling dulled into a distant vibration. The blazing crucible light became a steady glow instead of a chaotic flare. In that stretched moment of clarity, he felt it. Something was growing. Fine tendrils were pushing up from the crucible's bowl and into the open wounds in his palms. They were threading, weaving into the torn flesh as if searching for purchase. The great tree was growing into him. A flash of raw instinctive fear shot through him. His law seed flared in response. In his mind's eye, the small, radiant presence of inviolable self burned brighter. The principle he had forged, I am the final authority within myself, surged forward. He pushed that authority outward. No foreign will would claim him. No corruption or entity would find purchase within him. The pressure in his mind remained completely still. There was no probing presence. No invading consciousness. No attempt to override him. The law seed had nothing to repel. And that was the problem. The great tree was not reaching for his mind. It was not touching his soul. It was entering his body. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His law seed guarded his internal authority, his thoughts, his will, his very sense of self. But his flesh? He hadn't claimed authority over that in the same way. The tendrils thickened, spreading deeper into his palms and along his forearms like living channels. He could feel them merging with his reforged body, slotting into the lightning-tempered pathways already etched within him. This wasn't violent conquest. The great tree was integrating within him. He strained against the crucible again, veins standing out along his neck. The chamber trembled violently, wood groaning as something immense shifted far below. He felt it then, not just in the chamber, but through the connection in his hands. Something beneath the great tree was rising. Growing up towards him. The sensation echoed faintly inside him, as though whatever was expanding below was using him as a conduit. The burning in his palms intensified, but beneath it was a strange resonance. The same harmonized lightning he had absorbed before now pulsed through the invading growth. It matched the reforged channels in his body almost perfectly. Cade's breathing grew ragged and again he felt powerless. But this time it was not because something was trying to dominate or destroy him. But because something was changing him. And he had no idea whether he could stop it. Cade had no idea what he could do. The tendrils continued to sprout from the crucible's bowl, slithering into the wounds in his palms and threading deeper into his arms. He felt them like foreign veins forcing themselves into existence beneath his skin, alive, deliberate, and unstoppable. He gritted his teeth and focused inward. His law seed flared in his mind's eye, bright and steady. He seized onto it, pouring his will into the principle he had forged. He was the final authority within himself. Nothing external would claim him. Nothing would rewrite him. He pushed that authority outward down his arms, into his flesh, trying to halt the invasive growth. It did nothing. The tendrils didn't hesitate. They didn't even acknowledge his resistance. He might have developed a law seed that protected his mind or soul, he still wasn't entirely sure which, but it clearly did not extend to his physical body. The system notification had only granted willpower and wisdom. Neither stat had ever been tied to raw physical control. And right now, his body was the battlefield. The growth pushed past his elbows. He felt fibers splitting and re-splitting inside him, dividing into thinner and thinner filaments the deeper they burrowed. Agony flared with every new path carved through muscle and marrow. His shoulders locked. His chest seized as tendrils spread inward, seeking space between bone and organ. He gasped but forced himself not to scream. This hurt. Fuck, it hurt. But he had endured worse. Reforging his bones in the crucible had felt like being shattered and rebuilt simultaneously. Lightning had flayed him from the inside out, and he had survived that. He would survive this too. Whatever this was. He would find some way to survive. The tendrils reached his chest and branched downward. He felt them spreading through his ribs, slipping along his spine, diving into his abdomen. Finer and finer threads infiltrated his torso, his hips, his thighs. It was as if the great tree was mapping him from the inside. Searching for something. The chamber walls continued to press inward, wood flexing and groaning. The space around him shrank, bark grinding against bark. He was running out of room. Then, when he felt the tiniest tendrils penetrate the smallest spaces in his limbs, when every part of him from the neck down felt threaded through with foreign growth. The connection in his palms severed. The crucible released him. Cade didn't hesitate. He yanked his hands free, stumbling backward. The sudden absence of contact sent him reeling. He nearly collapsed from dizziness as blood loss and pain crashed over him. The tendrils did not disappear, they writhed inside of him. He swayed on his feet, vision tunneling, but forced himself to move. The chamber walls were still closing in, sealing over like a wound healing shut. If he stayed here, he'd be entombed. He staggered toward the tunnel, grabbing the wooden walls with shaking hands to keep from falling over. His palms burned where the wounds had been, though the cuts themselves were already knitting closed around whatever had embedded within him. He shoved his head into the vertical shaft and prepared to descend. And froze. Pearl's bright orange head was directly below him, climbing upward. Confusion cut through the haze. What was she doing here? Shouldn't she still be below, completing her storm-calling trial? He opened his mouth to ask, but no sound came out. The world tilted violently. His grip slipped. The last thing he saw was Pearl's eyes widening as darkness surged up to swallow him whole. Pearl had never felt such certainty. The moment the thread of life essence from above connected with the vast reservoir below, she had known that she had passed both the Stormacaller and Life Breather's trials. And not in the shallow way the songs described. Not by merely softening the surface and coaxing a fragile sprout from newly enriched soil. She had pierced the barrier entirely. She had restored what had been severed from the great tree. The immense well of life essence beneath the ash had not been random. It had been the great tree's ninth root pillar. Cut off and sealed beneath cycles of desolation. And she had healed the wound. Using lightning and her own essence, she had transformed the suffocating ash that acted as a barrier. Then, in the final breath of her power, she had breathed life into the connection itself, bridging the storm root above with the dormant root below. She had made the great tree whole. Perhaps for the first time since their realm had been sealed by their progenitor. Her consciousness had rushed back into her body as the ground began to tremble. The shallow pool empty, its water soaked in by the surge of growth beneath. Then the earth split around her. Thousands of tiny tendrils burst from the ground around her, pale and luminous. They spiraled upward, weaving around one another in intricate patterns. What began as fragile strands quickly thickened, braiding into cords, then ropes, then a massive column of living wood. The new root pillar surged upward, racing toward the storm root above. They met in a resounding pulse of essence. The moment the two touched, the entire hollow thrummed with harmony. Lightning essence and life essence blended seamlessly, cycling in a way that felt complete. Pearl stood slowly as the growth stabilized around her. The ninth root pillar was not smooth. Not yet. It was a chaotic lattice of interwoven tendrils, still fusing together, bark forming where raw growth had been moments before. But it stood tall and unbroken, connecting floor to ceiling in a continuous column of restored life. The great tree felt different now. More whole than it had been before. Pearl placed a hand against the hollow inside of the newly formed root and closed her eyes briefly in reverence. The songs had spoken of rewards once all 3 trials were complete. They had never spoken of how those rewards were given. She glanced upward toward the vertical shaft Kate had used. Should she wait here? Perhaps the great tree would bestow its gifts when both of them were present. They had arrived together after all. Or perhaps she should check on him. He had done something extraordinary to restore the storm root. Something reckless, no doubt. Her decision settled quickly. She would go up. The newly formed root pillar provided natural holds. As she climbed, she found the vertical shaft he had disappeared into. Tendrils had woven themselves around it without sealing it entirely. The tendrils gave way to wooden rungs embedded in the side of the shaft. She transitioned smoothly, climbing faster now. The air inside the shaft was dim and close, sunlight cut off by the dense new growth. But as she ascended, she noticed an amber glow from above. As she climbed higher, the amber light intensified. She was only a meter from an opening in the side of the shaft when a head suddenly emerged from it. Cade. His eyes widened when he saw her. Then his body went slack. He collapsed, unconscious. It was fortunate his body had not fully cleared the side opening. If Cade had leaned even a little farther out, he would have fallen straight down the shaft and taken her with him. Instead, his unconscious form sagged in the side tunnel. Pearl lunged upward, gripping the rungs with one hand while bracing his shoulder with the other. His weight was considerable, far denser than a creature of his size should have been, but she managed to stabilize him. Reckless human, she muttered under her breath. She climbed the remaining distance carefully, hauling herself into the side chamber and pushing Cade fully inside. The amber glow that filled the cramped space came from an opening behind him. She paused. The chamber's far walls were shifting. No, that wasn't quite right. They were growing. Wood rippled along the curved walls, fibers weaving together as seams knit shut and the chamber slowly constricted. Just before the great tree sealed the chamber at the end of this side shaft completely, Pearl caught a final glimpse of its heart. From the floor, a wooden lightning bolt jutted upward, its edges raw and sharp. From the ceiling above, a slender branch had grown downward to meet it. At the branch's tip trembled a single drop of glowing amber sap, suspended like a falling star. Faint channels traced the length of the wooden bolt, their multicolored light dimming with each passing breath. At its peak rested a shallow bowl, its inner curve stained a deep, dark red. Blood. Then the walls drew together, and the chamber vanished from sight. Her eyes moved back to Cade. Thick red lines marked both of his palms, as if fresh wounds had only just sealed shut. Understanding dawned on her. He had fed the heart with his own blood. Pearl inhaled slowly through her nose. She would speak to him about this once he regained consciousness. She could not leave him here. Pearl knelt beside him, sliding her arms beneath his shoulders. His body was limp but still warm, breath steady despite his pallor. She felt no immediate threat to his life, though his essence was strange. There was something new threaded through it. Something ancient and familiar. Curiosity tugged at her, but survival came first. She maneuvered him toward the shaft, positioning herself below so she could guide his descent. With careful movements and the aid of her adhesive pads, she lowered him step by step. When she finally reached the hollow beneath the great tree, she saw what had changed. The pool was now completely gone. Where water had once rested, the base of the newly grown root pillar now filled the space entirely. The pillar was thicker than before, its surface still uneven with fused tendrils knitting together into solid bark. She laid him gently against a solid section of the outer curve of the ninth root pillar and retrieved his tortoise shell from where it had been left earlier, setting it on top of him. He would want it when he woke. For a moment, she simply looked around. The hollow was utterly transformed. The storm root above and the newly risen ninth root pillar below had fused into one structure. What had once stood divided was now joined in an unbroken column, the lattice growing together. The lightning that had once pulsed through the hollow was gone, replaced by a steady, surging current of life essence flowing through the fresh growth. The great tree was restoring itself completely. Pearl exhaled. The trials were truly finished. She settled down beside Cade, her back resting against the living wood of the 9th root pillar. Warmth seeped through her skin, gentle and reassuring. As she rested there, catching her breath, the 9th root pillar trembled softly behind her. At first she thought it was merely the lingering aftershock of the tree's restoration. But the vibration focused above her. She tilted her head upward. A small bulge formed in the bark directly above her. Pearl stilled. The bark split with a faint wooden sigh, and a tender green sprout pushed outward. It unfurled slowly, stretching toward the open air of the hollow. Before her eyes, it thickened, lengthened, and hardened into a small branch no longer than her forearm. She watched in reverent silence. At the tip of the newborn branch, a bud formed. It swelled rapidly, fed by the immense current of life essence flowing through the restored pillar. The bud brightened from pale green to warm gold. Light gathered beneath its thin outer skin, intensifying until it resembled a captured sun cradled in bark. Then the outer layer split gently, revealing a perfectly formed, glowing golden fruit hanging from the end of the branch. Pearl's breath left her in a whisper. The fruit radiated a steady, harmonious glow. It called to her. Not in words, but in resonance. In recognition. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached upward. Then she hesitated. There was only one fruit. Her gaze shifted to Cade, still unconscious at the base of the root pillar. She could not have restored the 9th root without him. Without his reckless actions, the storm root would never have reignited. Without that final torrent of lightning, she would have failed. This fruit, if it was her reward, what of him? She lowered her hand slightly. That is not right, she murmured softly. He deserves one as well. A presence washed over her. It was not sudden or overwhelming. It did not press or command. It simply was ancient, vast, and impossibly deep. The great tree's awareness enveloped her like warm sunlight filtering through leaves. Pearl bowed instinctively. From the presence came reassurance. Gentle certainty. The fruit above her was hers and hers alone. It was not meant to be divided. Not meant to be shared. Pearl swallowed, still uneasy. And the human, she asked quietly. Will he be rewarded? The presence shifted. There was no spoken answer. Only a quiet affirmation that settled into her. He already has been rewarded. Pearl's eyes widened slightly as the presence began to fade, retreating back into the vast trunk of the great tree. Her gaze drifted once more to Cade's healing palms. Understanding flickered, but she did not yet grasp its full meaning. Slowly, reverently, she reached up and plucked the golden fruit from the branch. Up close, it was even more radiant. Its surface shimmered faintly, like captured sunlight. Life essence thrummed within it, not wild or overwhelming like the 9th root pillar, but refined and purposeful. This was her reward. Pearl bowed her head slightly in gratitude to the great tree. Then, without further hesitation, she lifted the fruit to her lips and bit into it. Golden light spilled across her vision as she swallowed. Dryness and desolation were the path. The only true path. Brahm believed that with a certainty that burned hotter than the white flames coiled inside his core. Life was rot. Life was excess. Left unchecked, it spread, tangled, and devoured everything. The frogs sang of growth and harmony, but Brahm knew the truth. If life was allowed to flourish without the cleansing march of ash, it would swallow this realm whole. The Ashen Front understood this. And so did he. Brahm lumbered through the swamp jungle like a walking calamity. Nearly 2 meters tall at the crown of his domed shell, he moved with ponderous, deliberate force. Each step of his thick, sturdy legs sank deep into the muck before rising again with a wet suctioning sound. Moisture hissed faintly against the heat radiating from his body. His shell was layered in plates the color of grey bone with faint pearlescent undertones, streaked with veins of faint white heat that pulsed in time with his slow, steady breaths. Ash clung to him constantly, sifting from the seams of his plates with each heavy stomp. The air around him shimmered slightly, distorted by the low aura of desolation he kept carefully restrained. Creatures fled long before he reached them. Swamp serpents slid frantically from sun-warmed rocks into dark water. Bright feathered birds exploded upward from the canopy in startled flocks. Even the massive leeches that lurked in stagnant pools recoiled at his approach, sinking into the depths rather than risk the scorching dryness that followed in his wake. They sensed what he was. A harbinger of desolation itself. The frogs, however, were another matter entirely. Their kind was an affront to the natural order. They sang songs of life, breathed vitality into barren ground, and dared to call that righteousness. They were blind to the creeping hunger of growth. Blind to how life mutated, twisted, and devoured everything if not regularly purged. Brahm's jaws clenched as he pushed through a curtain of broad, waxy leaves. The plants recoiled from the faint heat radiating from his thick hide, edges curling slightly before he passed. This realm had been knotted shut by the frog's ancestor. Sealed away from the greater multiverse in a misguided attempt to preserve it. Fools! Brahm would burn that knot into nothingness. He would ascend beyond this sealed realm, beyond the suffocating humidity and endless greenery. His kind would be free of this stagnant prison. Though if he were honest, that freedom was secondary. His own ascension mattered more. He was less than a full cycle old, yet already the elders had marked him as extraordinary. A prodigy. His flames were the purest of any hatchling. His will was unwavering. The Duke of Desolation himself had once regarded him with something close to approval. So Brahm had slipped past the ashen front. He had travelled alone into the frog's jungle, suppressing the instinct to ignite everything around him. It took discipline to hold his flames back. The life here disgusted him. Vines coiled around trunks in choking embraces. Moss crawled across bark. The air itself felt thick with damp vitality. But he endured. If he burned too soon, he would reveal himself before reaching his true target. The great tree. Every cycle, the frogs sent their younglings to nurture some pathetic spark of life beneath its hollow. And every cycle, one of his kind was granted the honor of destroying that creation, devouring its concentrated essence. The Duke of Desolation had told him of it. Of the reward. Of the surge of essence that flooded the tortoise who reduced the frog's efforts to ash. Just remembering the story made Brahm's throat heat. He would not waste his flames on weeds and insects. He would save them for the true prize. And when he reached the great tree, he would burn brighter than any tortoise before him. The jungle thickened as Brahm pressed forward, roots rising from the earth like the ribs of some colossal beast. The air grew heavier, saturated with mist and the cloying scent of life. Even with his aura restrained, leaves nearest his path yellowed faintly at the edges as he passed. Then he saw it. The maze. It rose from the swamp floor in a tangled wall of colossal mangrove-like roots, braided and fused together into a living barricade. The roots were thicker than Brahm's body, arching upward and interlocking in a lattice that formed a towering perimeter. Pale green moss clung to the bark, and a low, swirling mist pooled at its base, shifting as though it possessed awareness. The frog's mist weaver trial. Brahm snorted, a thin curl of dry heat escaping his nostrils. Even though he was less than a full cycle old, his core had already formed dense and bright within his abdomen. The elders had called him a prodigy. Said his affinity for desolation was unusually pure. He had earned that praise. Every scrap of life he encountered along the ashen front had been reduced beneath his breath. His core was not yet perfect. But it would be. The essence he would devour from the great tree would push him beyond perfection. Beyond his current limitations. All that stood between him and that destiny was the maze of roots before him. Brahm stepped closer until the massive interwoven trunks loomed overhead. He could feel the dense life essence humming within them. It thrummed with quiet vitality, like a heartbeat beneath bark. Disgusting. He reached inward and touched his core. The desolation within it stirred instantly, eager and ravenous. It pressed against the boundaries of containment, longing to flood his channels and erupt into flame. During his journey here, he had kept it sealed tightly within, not allowing even the faintest wisp to leak out. Endurance was his weakness as he had not yet been alive long enough to truly push himself. Now, he loosened the restraint on his core just slightly. A trickle of essence slipped from his core and flowed into his channels. The change was immediate. Warmth surged through his veins, and the trickle of power transformed as it traveled, sharpening into his signature white flames. They licked along the interior of his throat, eager to be released. He held his head high, scanning the root wall carefully. The maze was grown, not built. There were imperfections. Places where two massive roots had pressed together but had not fully fused. He found one such weakness. A narrow seam between two towering roots where bark overlapped unevenly. Perfect. Brahm inhaled slowly, drawing the contained trickle of desolation upward. He felt it gather in his throat, condensing into something sharp and focused. Then he exhaled. White flame poured from his mouth in a concentrated stream. The effect was immediate. Where the flame touched, bark blackened and cracked. The dense life essence within the roots shrieked in resistance before collapsing into pale ash. The seam between the roots widened as the flames devoured the living tissue holding them together. The mist recoiled from the heat, parting around him. Within moments, a hole just large enough for Brahm to squeeze through had been carved into the wall. He cut the flames off instantly, an enormous demonstration of control on his part. A faint trickle of reclaimed essence seeped back into him, the residue of consumed vitality. It was insignificant compared to what he had expended, but it pleased him nonetheless. At his feet lay nothing but white ash where living root had once stood. Brahm stepped forward, pushing through the opening. The mist within the maze swirled around him, thick and disorienting to most creatures. It shifted to obscure paths, to twist perception and direction. But it failed to trick or deceive Brahm. Even without releasing more flame, the natural aura of desolation around him caused the mist to thin and wither where it touched him. Illusions shimmered and collapsed in his presence. The maze was designed to confuse, but Brahm had no intention of walking it properly. He would not search for paths, he would make them. As the first inner wall loomed before him, he drew another measured trickle of essence from his core. Let the frogs hide behind tricks and turns. He would burn through every obstacle between him and the heart of the great tree. By the time Brahm reached what he knew to be the final wall of the maze, a subtle heaviness had crept into his limbs. He had burned through root after root, carving a straight path where winding corridors had once stood. The maze's tricks, shifting mist, false openings, looping turns had all crumbled beneath white flame. Wherever he exhaled, life essence collapsed into pale ash and drifted to the swamp floor. But it had cost him. Nearly a quarter of his core's reserves had been spent forcing his way through. The life essence he consumed in return had replenished some of it more than he had anticipated, but it had not equaled what he expended. The roots were rich, yet young. Potent, but not ancient. Still, his confidence did not falter. He rolled his shoulders, thick ashen plates grinding softly against one another as he stepped toward the final barrier. The wall before him felt different. Denser and older than the others. The life essence within it pulsed with a steadier rhythm. And beyond it, he could taste it. Ancient vitality saturated the air on the other side. Vast and layered deep with age. The great tree. His breath slowed as anticipation coiled within him. He gathered another measured stream of desolation from his core. Just enough to burn through this final obstacle. White fire built in his throat, hotter than before. With a focused exhale, he released it. The final root wall blackened instantly. The dense life essence within it resisted more fiercely than the others had, but resistance only made the consumption sweeter. The flames chewed through bark and fiber, reducing cycles of growth into crumbling white ash. When the opening was large enough, Brahm cut off the flame without hesitation. He stepped through and stopped at what was before him. For the first time since beginning his journey, stillness claimed him. The great tree towered before him, so immense that it bent perspective. Its trunk rose like a mountain of living wood, broader than any structure he had ever seen. Its canopy pierced upward into the clouds, leaves shimmering in filtered sunlight. If Brahm had not known the boundaries of this sealed realm, he would have believed the tree extended beyond them. Life essence rolled from it in waves. It was steady, ancient, and smelled delicious. 8 colossal root pillars arched downward around the perimeter of the trunk, holding the immense structure aloft and creating a vast hollow beneath. That much matched the tails. But beneath the very center of the tree, Brahm's eyes narrowed. There was a 9th pillar. It rose from the hollow's floor directly beneath the trunk, thick and powerful, almost as large as the 8 outer supports. It was not a thin sprout or a fragile construct as the elders' stories had described. It was mature and far too stable to be newly grown. Packed with dense life essence that rivaled the tree itself. That was wrong. The frog's trials, as told in tortoise lore, always resulted in some meager growth beneath the hollow. A pathetic sprout fat with vitality, yes, but young and easily destroyed. This looked ancient. Brahm's confidence wavered for the briefest instant. The great tree was larger than he had imagined. Its essence was deeper than he thought possible. More layered. The 9th pillar radiated strength and rich vitality rather than fragility. For the first time, a sliver of doubt brushed his thoughts. Would his flames be enough? He crushed the thought immediately. Weakness. He claimed the position of chosen for this cycle. The Duke of Desolation himself had spoken of the opportunity. Of the essence that would be gained by destroying the frog's creation beneath the hollow. And what essence it would be. The denser the vitality, the richer the return when consumed by his flames of desolation. He felt it already, his essence stirring eagerly at the sight of so much life. He would not hesitate any further. He may have spent a quarter of his reserves, but what remained was more than sufficient. And once his flames bit into that ninth pillar, the torrent of reclaimed essence would eclipse anything he had spent reaching this place. He would not burn blindly. He would find the optimal point, the place where flame would take hold most effectively, where the return would be greatest. Brahm began descending the sloped earth toward the hollow beneath the great tree, eyes fixed on the prize. The time for restraint was nearly over. The slope beneath the great tree was steep but firm, packed earth veined with thick roots that twisted like petrified serpents through the soil. Brahm descended slowly, each heavy step deliberate. The ground trembled faintly under his weight, flakes of dry ash shaking loose from the edges of his shell. The ninth pillar drew him in like a lodestone. Up close, its scale became even more apparent. The pillar was not some fragile sprout hastily grown for ritual. It was thick as a tower, its bark dense and ridged, its surface humming with steady, ancient vitality. Essence flowed through it in deep currents, far more stable than the flickering life he had consumed in the maze. Destroying this would not simply grant him a surge. It would be transformative. He began to circle the perimeter, remaining just outside the 8 outer root pillars. His dark eyes traced the surface of the ninth support, searching for weakness and imperfection in the grain, a seam where essence pooled unevenly. He would strike once, and when he did, he would not stop until all was ash. That was when he saw her. A small figure seated in the shallow hollow beneath the tree. Orange. Bright against the soil. A frog. Brahm's breath stilled. She was young, smaller than the grand elder that travelled behind the ashen front, but she radiated essence. Not the shallow vibrancy of common life. This was refined. Her core pulsed in rhythm with the great tree itself. His eyes widened. There was resonance there. Her essence matched the pilla's potency. How fortunate he was! He must have arrived at the perfect moment just after she completed her trial. The elders had spoken of such timing being extraordinarily rare. To catch a frog in the aftermath of their ritual of growth was to find life essence at its most concentrated. She would be the tinder. Destroy her first, and the pilla's defenses would weaken. Her burning would ignite the greater blaze. Exhilaration flared hot within him. He lowered himself instinctively, though stealth was not his strength. His heavy limbs sank into the soil with muted thuds. But the frog did not stir. She was deep in meditation, unaware of her encroaching desolation. Brahm's lips curled slightly. Foolish creature! As he moved closer, another shape entered his awareness. Something pale sat near her. Brahm slowed. It was upright. Fleshy and bare. It was not a frog nor a tortoise. It had limbs like some malformed swamp creature, thin compared to his own thick columns of muscle. Its flesh lacked the hardened shell and ashen hue of his kind. Yet, his eyes fixed on its front. A shell. A tortoise shell. Small and dim compared to his own luster, but unmistakable. Confusion rippled through him. What kind of deformity was this? A tortoise twisted into soft flesh? Or some frog creation mocking his kind's image? Worse. It sat beside the frog without devouring her. Every tortoise knew the truth. Frogs were treasures to the path of desolation. Consuming one could advance a cultivator an entire stage in a single feast. And this creature simply sat there. It was weak. Unworthy of his kind. Brahm's confusion curdled into disdain. It did not matter what it was. It would burn all the same. The frog would be the spark. The strange shelled creature would be additional fuel. And then the ninth pillar would fall, and with it the entire great tree would be consumed by his flames. Brahm's core stirred eagerly, desolation pressing against its boundaries, longing to be released. The time for subtlety was over. Cade came back to consciousness slowly. At first there was only darkness and the dull awareness of his own breathing. Then a system notification flared faintly at the edge of his vision. He ignored it. His body felt fine, surprisingly. Not great but fine. A little sore, like he had pushed himself too far in a workout. But there was no agony, no feeling of writhing tendrils inside his skin. He flexed his fingers experimentally. No pain. Cade lifted his hands in front of his face. Thin red lines marked both palms, straight and narrow where he had cut himself with Pearl's spearhead. The lacerations had already sealed shut, leaving only faint traces behind. He pressed a thumb against one of the lines. Smooth. No tenderness or swelling. His reforged body had healed quickly, far quicker than he would have guessed, especially after losing that much blood. He remembered the dizziness, the way the crucible had nearly drained him dry. Yet now there was nothing left but a faint stiffness in his muscles. He shifted and became aware of rough bark behind him. Cade glanced around and realized he was back in the hollow beneath the great tree. Except it wasn't the same hollow. The shallow pool was gone. In its place rose a massive root pillar, thick and newly formed, bark still uneven in places as if it had grown in a rush. It filled what had once been the center of the space. His back rested against it. Pearl must have brought him down. He looked down and saw his tortoise shell carefully draped over his legs like a blanket. A faint, reluctant smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. She'd even thought to grab that. He turned his head slightly and saw Pearl sitting beside him, legs folded beneath her in her meditative posture. Her eyes were closed, expression serene. He didn't know what she was doing, but he knew better than to interrupt her. He hated being pulled out of focus, and he wouldn't do that to her. Cade leaned his head back against the newly grown root pillar and exhaled slowly as he opened the system notification. Primordial heartwood rhizome, juvenile, established. An organism derived from the heartwood of the great tree has fused itself to your internal and metaphysical channels. Converts personal resources to produce living growth. Cade stared at the words and horror slowly spread across his face. What the fuck, he shouted before he could stop himself. A parasite. The great tree had implanted a parasite inside him. After everything he did, everything he accomplished. He'd made it through the mist maze. Cleansed corruption from the crucible. Torn a leech off the storm root. And even fed the damn crucible his own blood so Pearl could complete her trial. And this was his reward? Was this some twisted dungeon mechanic? Some long con? Had the great tree waited until he lowered his guard to shove part of itself into his body? He read through the notification again. Primordial. Heartwood. Rhizome. Converts personal resources to produce living growth. His stomach twisted. Was it feeding on him? Draining him? Using him as fertilizer? How long before it spread too far to remove? He felt suddenly, violently stupid for trusting an ancient tree just because it didn't immediately try to kill him like almost everything else had. Unbelievable, he said, panic creeping in around the edges of his thoughts. Was this his reward for completing the trials, or just the next way this place planned to screw him over? It had to be a mistake. Maybe he was misinterpreting the system's words. There was no way this was intentional. No way the great tree's idea of a reward was to implant a parasitic part of itself inside of his body. Cade dismissed the notification and immediately turned toward Pearl. She was still seated in meditation, golden light faintly flickering beneath her orange skin in slow, steady pulses. He didn't care. Pearl, he said sharply. No response. Panic tightened in his chest. How long did he have before this thing started spreading again? Before it dug deeper? Before it took control of something vital? He reached out and grabbed her shoulder, shaking her. Pearl. Wake up. Her eyes snapped open, irritation flashing for half a heartbeat before settling into focus. Cade, she began, calm but firm, I am in the middle of. The great tree implanted something in me, he cut in, voice tight. Some kind of parasite. It's called a primordial heartwood rhizome. It says it fused itself to my internal and metaphysical channels. Pearl blinked once. Cade pushed on before she could speak, panic creeping in his voice. I don't know what it does. It says it converts my personal resources to produce living growth. I don't want it converting anything. I don't want a plant living inside me. We need to get it out. Her expression shifted. Slow down. Panicking will not improve your situation. Panicking feels appropriate right now, Cade shot back. She studied him briefly, gaze sweeping over his posture, his breathing, the faint red lines on his palms. You appear stable. Your essence does not feel corrupted. Corrupted isn't the problem, he said through clenched teeth. I have been infested. I was in the middle of stabilizing the life essence granted to me from the trials, Pearl said, voice tightening slightly. You interrupted that process. Sorry, he snapped. I'll try to schedule my parasitic infection better next time. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Cade saw movement from behind her. His eyes shifted past her shoulder and locked onto one of the archways between the giant root pillars that circled the hollow. Cade's stomach dropped. A lumbering creature was creeping up on them. Cade's eyes narrowed and he triggered Identify. Ash tortoise? That's not helpful. Cade thought as he cursed his nearly useless skill. The ash tortoise was massive, easily a head taller than Cade, with thick, corded muscles bulging beneath ashen white skin stretched tight over its frame. Its shell was darker than the rest of it, charcoal grey edged with jagged fissures that glowed faintly from within. It moved far too quickly for something of its size. Each step was heavy but precise, claws digging into the earth as it advanced with predatory focus. And even from this distance, Cade could see the edges of its mouth curl upward into something disturbingly close to a smile. White flames flickered faintly along the corners of its mouth. Cade's breath hitched. For half a second he saw something else superimposed over it, the towering bulk of the Ashen Emperor, flames devouring everything they touched. He knew that fire. He knew what it could do to the massive body of the worm, what it could do to them. Cade surged into motion. In one smooth movement he grabbed the tortoise shell from the ground and vaulted over Pearl, planting himself between her and the now charging tortoise. Pearl made a startled sound behind him. Cade. He didn't answer. The ash tortoise closed the distance rapidly, covering meters in heartbeats. It stopped a few paces away and drew in a deep, rumbling breath. White flames licked between its jaws. Stay close behind me, Cade yelled. The tortoise exhaled. A torrent of white fire erupted outward. Cade raised the shell and braced. The flames slammed into the curved surface, washing around it in a blinding surge. Heat roared past him, white light swallowing his vision, but none of it penetrated. The shell held. He felt no searing burn through his hands as the white fire split around the shield, spilling to either side. The blast lasted only seconds before sputtering out. Silence fell. Pearl and Cade were untouched. But beside them the newly restored ninth root pillar burned with hungry white flames. Run, Cade said immediately, not taking his eyes off the ash tortoise. Get out of here. I'll hold it off. What? Pearl's voice cracked. No. Go. The tortoise let out a low, rumbling chuckle. It vibrated through the hollow like stone grinding on stone. I am surprised, it said in a deep, gravelly voice. Such a mutated creature speaks the tortoise tongue. Cade blinked. I'm not speaking tortoise, he shot back automatically. The tortoise's ember-like eyes narrowed slightly. You are. Cade's stomach twisted. He didn't know how to speak tortoise. He had been speaking to Pearl and yet the tortoise understood him perfectly. How can you understand me? Cade demanded. The tortoise snorted, a thin ribbon of smoke curling from its nostrils. Because you speak as we do. Its mouth peeled back in a slow grin. It does not matter. You will both burn the same. Pearl's breath had grown shallow behind him. The ashen front, she whispered. Already? That is impossible. Cade shifted his stance, keeping the shield angled between them and the creature. Pearl. Go. Now. I will not leave you, she snapped, though fear trembled through her voice. You have to. The tortoise took a deliberate step forward, claws grinding into the earth. I am Brahm, it declared. Harbinger of the Ashen Front. Destroyer. I have come to erase this perversion of life. Its gaze flicked toward the burning ninth root pillar with open disdain before returning to them. You will serve as kindling. Today is the day the great tree falls to desolation. Pearl made a small, strangled sound. Cade risked a glance back at her. She looked pale beneath her orange skin, eyes wide and unfocused. No frog has ever escaped a destroyer, she whispered. We are dead. Cade turned fully for half a second and grabbed her shoulder, forcing her to look at him. Hey! Stop! Her eyes locked onto his. Listen to me, he said firmly. You're faster than me and you can mistweave. If we both run, it'll catch us. If you run and I distract it, you'll make it. I will not leave you to die, she said, voice shaking. He forced a grin onto his face. I survived the ashen wastes, he said. I've got the shell of an ash tortoise. It can't burn me. I'll hold it for a few seconds. You hit the mists. Once you're gone, I'll bail. I've got a plan. That part was a lie, but she didn't need to know that. Brahm let out a booming laugh. Plan? You think you have a plan? Cade ignored him. Pearl, he said more quietly, eyes steady. Go. Don't let this thing turn you into fuel for whatever path of desolation crap it's chasing. Her breathing stuttered. Terror warred with trust in her expression. Go, he repeated. For a long heartbeat she hesitated. Then she nodded once. Cade gave her a reassuring smile he didn't feel, spun her around, and gave her a firm push away from the tortoise. Run and don't look back. Keep running until you make it back to the village. Pearl staggered forward, then broke into a sprint toward the distant mist barrier. Cade turned back toward Brahm. White flames flickered faintly at the edges of the tortoise's mouth. The 9th root pillar crackled beside him as it continued to burn. Cade lifted the shell and squared his shoulders. All right, he muttered. Let's see what you've got. Cade stepped sideways, putting distance between himself and the burning root pillar. He raised the ash tortoise shell in his left hand. Hey, he shouted at Brahm. You want to destroy something? Try me. The ash tortoise's eyes narrowed. Smoke curled from its nostrils as it exhaled sharply. If you wish to die alone, mutated one, I will honor your challenge. Its mouth peeled back in a grin. And when you are ash under my feet, I will hunt the frog. Cade's jaw tightened. Oh yeah? What makes you think you can beat me? The next instant, Brahm moved. Cade barely registered the shift in weight before the massive tortoise launched forward. It crossed the distance between them in a blur of ashen muscle and clawed feet. It was way too fast. Cade had always associated tortoises with slow, deliberate movement. Brahm shattered that assumption in less than a second. The ground cracked beneath the impact of its charge as it barreled toward him. Cade braced but he felt no impact. Brahm had stopped his charge just inches from Cade. He planted his claws, lifted his head, and inhaled sharply through his nostrils. His chest expanded grotesquely, then he exhaled. White fire erupted from his mouth in a roaring torrent. Cade fully ducked behind the shell just in time as the flames struck the shield with explosive force. For a heartbeat, all he could see was white. A blinding, colorless wave enveloped him like a star stripped of warmth and mercy. It roared against the shell, spreading outward, trying to wrap around its edges. Cade crouched lower, angling the shell to catch the brunt of it. Still, white flames licked around the rim and washed across his exposed arms. He waited for the heat, for his skin to blister, for the pain that would soon overwhelm his senses. But none came. There was pressure but no burning sensation. It felt more like a cool breeze rather than a raging fire enveloping him. Cade held firm. After 15 full seconds of uninterrupted, bleach-white destruction, the flames finally sputtered out, fading into thick smoke that coiled upward toward the hollow ceiling. Silence followed. Smoke filled the space between them, thick and acrid. Cade remained crouched behind the shield for a moment longer, heart hammering in his ears. Then he slowly straightened. The ground where he had stood was pure white, cracked and glassy, but he was untouched. The shell was untouched. Across from him, Brahm stared. The smug grin had vanished. Smoke drifted from the tortoise's mouth as his eyes narrowed. Well, Brahm rumbled slowly. That is, interesting. Cade rolled his shoulder once, testing his body. Everything felt intact. He allowed himself a small smirk. Yeah, he said. Those flames were nothing compared to the Ashen Emperor's. Brahm's eyes narrowed at the remark. Then he lowered his head slightly, claws digging into the ground again. You are no ordinary prey, the destroyer said. Good. This will be more enjoyable. Brahm was still only inches from the edge of Cade's shield when the tortoise moved again. Cade barely registered the shift in its shoulders before a massive, balled fist came hurtling toward him. The impact was explosive. The ash tortoise's knuckles slammed into the shell with a force that rattled Cade's teeth. A deep crack rang out through the hollow. Spiderweb fractures burst outward from the point of impact. Cade's stomach dropped. The shell had withstood the Ashen Emperor's corrosive ash. It had endured being struck by lightning, defended him from a horde of leeches, and even withstood direct blasts of violet lightning. It had blocked white fire moments ago without so much as a scorch mark. And now one punch sent cracks throughout the shell. Brahm drew his arm back again. Cade didn't hesitate this time. He backpedaled hard, bare feet skidding against the scorched earth. The tortoise's second punch tore through the space where Cade had just been, overextending slightly. Brahm stumbled forward half a step. Cade's mind reeled. The first impact had done more visible damage to the shell than anything since he'd taken it from the ashen wastes. That single blow had fractured something he'd come to think was nearly indestructible. He couldn't let this tortoise break his only real defense. Cade kept retreating, angling himself away from the direction Pearl had fled. Every step backward served two purposes: buy space and lead Brahm farther from the mist barrier she'd disappeared into. But Brahm recovered quickly. Far too quickly. With a snarl, the ash tortoise lunged again, covering the distance in a blur of bulk and muscle. Another fist crashed into the shell. Another sharp crack. More fractures radiated outward. You may carry a tortoise's shell, Brahm rumbled, smoke curling from his nostrils, but it is painfully clear you have no idea how to wield it. The words struck harder than the punches. Brahm was right, Cade didn't know how to use a shield. 2 weeks ago he'd been a postdoctoral researcher analyzing protein interactions. His most intense conflict had been arguing over grant funding and trying to get his work published. Now he was backpedaling from a sapient, flame-spewing tortoise bent on erasing him from existence. He adjusted his grip on the shell, heart pounding. Brahm was faster than he was. That was the real problem. Cade could barely react in time. If the tortoise kept up this relentless pressure, the shield would shatter before Cade ever found an opening to escape. The irony wasn't lost on him. Outpaced by a tortoise. Pre-system, tortoises had been the embodiment of slow and steady. But this thing moved like a heavyweight boxer crossed with a sprinter. Even after reforging his body in lightning after pushing his stats higher than any normal human, Cade still wasn't enough to keep up. Brahm feinted left, then drove another punch into the shell. Cade angled it just in time, but the impact still jarred his arms to the shoulder. The fractures widened. If something didn't change, this was going to end quickly. And not in his favor. His mind latched onto a single possibility, hyper-focused meditation. He had relied on it to steady himself during the Crucible's reforging, but he had never dared to trigger it in the middle of a fight. Would it sharpen him or slow him down at the wrong moment? Activating it mid-combat carried risk. One misstep and he would be dead. But if he didn't do something soon, the outcome would be the same. Brahm stepped in again, massive fist cocked back. Cade tightened his grip on the cracked shell and made his decision. He activated hyper-focused meditation. The shift was immediate. It felt like someone had reached into the world and turned a dial. Sounds around him dulled. The crackling of the burning root pillar softened. The grinding of Brahm's claws stretched into something slower, heavier. Even the tortoise's breath seemed to deepen and lengthen. Time hadn't actually slowed, but his perception had sharpened. The panic that had been creeping along the edges of his thoughts was forced down, flattened beneath a razor-thin line of clarity. His awareness narrowed until the world contained only two things. Him and Brahm. Cade felt every muscle in his body. Every micro-adjustment in his stance. The slight tremor in his left forearm from repeated impacts. The shift of weight in his hips as he pivoted. Brahm's next punch came. In normal time it would have been a blur. Now, Cade saw the sequence unfold: the tightening of the tortoise's shoulder, the torque in its torso, the way its weight shifted to its rear leg a fraction of a second before the fist drove forward. Cade didn't become any faster, but the skill sharpened his perception, allowing him to process information and respond with far greater precision. He angled the shell a hair earlier. Instead of absorbing the punch head-on, he let it glance off the curved surface. The impact still reverberated through him, but it didn't produce the violent crack of before. No new fractures spread. Brahm's eyes narrowed as he let loose another strike. Cade pivoted again, adjusting half an inch. The blow slid along the shell's curve instead of detonating against it. So it can help in combat, he thought distantly. Brahm growled and suddenly shifted tactics. Instead of another wild punch, the ash tortoise twisted at the waist and launched a spinning roundhouse kick at Cade's head. The thick, muscled leg cut through the air with shocking speed. Cade saw it coming. He dropped. The leg passed inches above him, wind from the swing ruffling his hair. And as he crouched, he saw his opening. Brahm's planted foot was momentarily overcommit. His balance was forward. Cade surged upward from his crouch, channeling everything he had into one clean motion. He drove the edge of the shell like a battering ram straight into the back of Brahm's supporting leg. The impact landed squarely against the hamstring. Brahm's eyes widened in surprise. The tortoise's massive body lifted backward from the force. His feet left the ground as momentum carried him over his own center of gravity. Brahm crashed onto his shell with a heavy, earth-shaking thud. For half a heartbeat, the hollow went still. Cade stared in disbelief that his gambit had worked. Struggling to right themselves had been a major weakness of pre-system tortoises, and Cade was willing to bet Brahm shared that same flaw. His heart kicked hard in his chest. This is it, this is the moment he could escape. He didn't hesitate any further. Instead of pressing the advantage recklessly, Cade backpedaled, keeping the cracked shield raised as he put distance between them. His eyes never left Braum as he retreated toward a mist barrier. On his back, the ash tortoise writhed. Clawed limbs scraped at empty air. His heavy body rocked side to side. For a moment, it looked almost pathetic. Cade felt something dangerously close to hope. Even with the skill active, the tension in his mind loosened slightly. He risked a quick glance over his shoulder. The mist barrier was still far but reachable if he sprinted. He could make it. When he looked back at Braum, the sight froze his blood. The tortoise's neck had extended far beyond what Cade had thought physically possible. Thick muscle corded along it as Braum pressed his face flat against the ground. With a violent, coordinated wriggle, he leveraged his neck like a hydraulic jack. His entire body shifted and in less than a heartbeat he flipped over. It was nothing like the clumsy animals Cade remembered from Earth. Braum landed on all fours with shocking grace, his ember-like eyes locking onto Cade. The ash tortoise launched forward. Cade managed 2 backward steps before the distance between them vanished. Braum was on him. Cade barely had time to raise the shield as Braum's fist slammed into it with crushing force. Even with hyper-focused meditation active, the impact rattled him as he failed to deflect it properly. The world jolted. His arms screamed as the shock traveled through bone and muscle. He felt himself lift off his feet. And then he was airborne. He crashed onto his back hard enough to drive the breath from his lungs. The cracked shell shield came down with him, barely staying between his body and the looming mass above. Unlike Cade, Braum didn't hesitate. A second punch detonated against the shield before Cade could roll. Then a third. Each strike was a hammer blow from a living siege engine. The reverberations blurred the edges of Cade's vision. His bones felt like tuning forks, vibrating violently with every impact. Fine splinters shook loose from the fractured shell and rained down onto his face. Another punch landed directly over the origin point of the first crack and the shell gave. A jagged hole burst through the center, shards snapping inward and clattering across Cade's chest. No. A fifth blow widened the opening, tearing the fracture into a gaping hole large enough to see through. Through it, he saw Braum. The tortoise lowered his head, eyes burning with savage satisfaction. His face pressed toward the hole. Cade could hear it, the deep inhale through twin nostrils as air was dragged inward. White light began to gather in the tortoise's gaping maw. Cade's pulse thundered. This is it. This was how he died. There was nothing between that bleach-white inferno and his face. The flames hadn't burned him before, hadn't even felt warm, but that had been at a distance, caught and deflected by the shell. At point-blank range, funneled straight into his face, he had no idea whether his strange resistance would still protect him. For a split second, fear threatened to fracture his focus. But hyper-focused meditation held his panic back, and in its place came awareness. In that moment, Cade felt everything. The tremor in his tricep from absorbing the blows. The shallow burn in his lungs from heaving breaths. The precise rhythm of his heart pounding in his chest. And beneath it lay something else entirely. A faint tingling stirred low in his abdomen. At first he thought it was just adrenaline, the aftershock of fear, but it spread too deliberately for that. It threaded outward through him along pathways he hadn't consciously mapped before, brushing past muscle and bone, scheming along the deeper currents that powered his movements and thoughts alike. Something was being gathered. His limbs felt subtly heavier even as his mind sharpened. A whisper of fatigue tugged at the edges of his awareness, accompanied by a thin, hollow ache beneath his ribs. The sensation flowed downward and outward, pulling from everywhere at once. From the strength coiled in his legs. From the steady rhythm in his chest. From the quiet reserve that fueled the sparks of lightning in his mind. It all streamed toward a single point. Down his right shoulder. Through his bicep. Into his forearm. Pooling into his palm. Right where the thin red line marked the place the great tree's parasite had entered him. The tingling intensified, no longer faint, but insistent. Focused. Cade's breath steadied. If I'm going to die, I'm not doing it flat on my back. Braum finished inhaling. The tortoise's mouth hung wide open, white brilliance building in his throat. Cade locked eyes with Braum and drove his right palm upward into the hole in the broken shell. The world narrowed and something inside of him surged outward. Cade felt it leave him, flowing through his palm like a liquid turning solid. His skin burned with a crawling pressure as he felt his flesh ripping itself apart. From between his fingers, he saw dark wood erupt outward. It shot forward in a thick, twisting line and slammed into the open roof of Brahm's mouth just as the white fire reached critical brightness. The impact forced the tortoise's head backward. White flames erupted but not toward Cade. The blast spewed sideways as the wooden growth drove Brahm's jaws off angle. The inferno scorched the air outside of the shell instead of pouring directly into Cade's face. For a split second, the hollow was illuminated from below, white fire backlighting the dark wooden growth protruding from Cade's palm. Even through the flames, the wood continued to grow. It thickened, branched, splintered outward. Tiny tendrils shot from its surface, stabbing into the soft flesh of Brahm's upper palate. Cade could feel resistance through the growth like pushing into dense clay, but the wood pressed onward. Brahm howled as he cut the flames off abruptly. With a violent snap of his jaws, the tortoise clamped down on the invading growth. The sudden pressure shattered the wood near Cade's palm. The recoil sent splinters flying. Cade felt the break like a snapped tendon, sharp and jarring but not crippling. Brahm staggered backward off him, clawing frantically at his mouth. Thick, muscular forelimbs scraped at his gums as he tried to dislodge embedded splinters. Short, explosive bursts of white fire blasted from his mouth in chaotic sprays, as if he were trying to cauterize the intrusion from the inside. Cade rolled to his side and scrambled to his feet. His broken shield clattered beside him, its center destroyed. A system notification pulsed faintly at the edge of his vision, but he ignored it. Now was not the time to read whatever it had to say. His right palm still tingled. When he looked down, the thin red line across it had reopened slightly. It wasn't bleeding, but it did glow faintly beneath the skin. There was no wood protruding from his palm now, but the channel it had grown from remained. His heart thundered with exhilaration. He had done that, or rather, the rhizome, his parasite, had surged from his body in response to a command he hadn't even realized he'd issued. Brahm lowered his claws slowly from his mouth. Burn marks marred the edges of his mouth where he'd tried to purge the wood with fire. Thin splinters still jutted from the edges of his gums. His ember-like eyes locked onto Cade. The earlier smugness was now gone. Heartwood, Brahm rumbled, voice thick with fury. You carry the great tree within you. Cade kept his eyes on Brahm as he flexed his right hand experimentally. He could still feel the pathway. The potential to call more of the parasite inside of him. It hadn't emptied him, but he wasn't untouched either. There was a faint hollowness beneath his ribs, a dull ache in his muscles like he'd pushed through a hard sprint, and a slight thinning in the clarity of his thoughts as if some quiet reserve had been siphoned away along with his strength. The growth hadn't come for free. Cade flicked his attention to his status and felt a jolt of confirmation. Every pool had dipped. Health, stamina, mana. All lower than they had been moments ago. He didn't linger on exact numbers or percentages, only registered the simple truth: whatever he had just done had drawn from all three resource pools. So this is what the system meant by converts personal resources to produce living growth. Brahm's claws dug into the earth. You are not prey, the destroyer growled. You are an infection. Life that must be culled before it grows out of control. Cade could feel the rhizome stirring within him. It no longer writhed or tore the way it had when it first burrowed into his flesh, now the sensation was deliberate. Subtle currents traced through him, winding along his hidden pathways, slipping between muscle and bone like roots probing fertile ground. He couldn't see them, but he felt their presence, coiled, attentive, and poised to answer his will. He knew he was close to understanding something. The sensation gathered again in his right palm, pooling beneath the thin red line. It pulsed in time with his heartbeat. He still held the cracked and broken tortoise shell in his left hand. It was damaged but still usable. But if he wanted to survive this encounter, dodging and blocking wasn't enough. If he wanted to live, he had to fight back. His mind flashed to the axe he wielded before coming to this corrupted dungeon. It was reliable and deadly against flesh, but such a weapon would be nearly useless here. Brahm wasn't exactly soft flesh. He was armored with a thick grey shell and tough hide. An axe would glance off or bite shallow at best. Against armor, slashing damage would be next to useless. He needed something with weight. Blunt force. Something that could break through the armor. A club. The thought crystallized in his mind and the rhizome answered. The gathering pressure in his palm intensified. Wood began to push outward from the center of his hand, not erupting violently like before, but flowing smoothly as new growth. Dark, dense grain extruded from his skin as though his body were shaping it deliberately. At the same time, something inside him dipped. His muscles felt heavier. His breathing shortened. A thin ache pressed behind his sternum, and his thoughts dulled at the edges. The cost of the rhizome growing a weapon for him was his own health, stamina, and mana. Less than 2 heartbeats later, the growth solidified. Cade found himself gripping a heavy, dark wooden club. The head was bulbous and thick, dense enough to crack stone. The handle tapered perfectly into his palm, shaped exactly to his grip. It had been grown for him alone, but he didn't have time to marvel at his new weapon. Across from him, Brahm lowered his claws from his mouth. The last of the splinters were gone. Ember-like eyes locked onto Cade. With a cracked shield in his left hand and a freshly grown club in his right, Cade squared his shoulders and braced for the destroyer's next charge. Brahm moved first. There was no warning growl this time, no dramatic declaration. One moment the ash tortoise stood coiled and watchful, the next he surged forward in a blur of pale muscle and grey shell. Despite his bulk, he crossed the distance in an instant. Both massive fists were already balled as he closed in. Cade's perception sharpened under hyper-focused meditation. He saw the shift in Brahm's hips, the torque building in his right shoulder, the fraction of a second where weight transferred forward. Brahm's fist launched and Cade twisted into it. Instead of absorbing the punch at full force, he stepped diagonally and shoved the cracked shell forward, intercepting the strike before Brahm's arm could fully extend. The blow glanced off the curved surface with a screech of friction instead of detonating straight through it. The impact still jarred his arm, but it didn't break him. Cade didn't waste the opening. Using the same rotational momentum, he swung the club in a tight, brutal arc at Brahm's exposed flank. The heavy wooden head slammed into the seam where the tortoise's stomach plating met the darker back shell. A sharp, ringing crack split the air and Brahm's eyes widened. The combined effect of his deflected punch and the unexpected strike to the seam threw his balance sideways. The tortoise stumbled hard to Cade's left, claws gouging trenches in the earth as he tried to stabilize. Cade stepped in. He pivoted around Brahm's bulk and brought the club down again, this time against the back of Brahm's shell. The impact landed with a deep, resonant boom. Force traveled through the club and into Cade's right arm, rattling his bones. His shoulder screamed from the recoil. But the hit amplified Brahm's loss of balance. The ash tortoise slammed belly first into the earth, the impact blasting a shallow crater beneath it. The force rippled through the hollow, sending a tremor through root and stone alike. For the first time since the battle began, Brahm let out a sound that wasn't laced with smugness or mockery, instead it was a raw, guttural grunt of pain. Brahm's left hand immediately moved toward the cracked seam at his flank where Cade's first strike had landed. Cade backed up 3 steps, breathing hard. He lifted the damaged shell shield into a defensive guard while shaking out his right arm. The reverberation from striking that back shell had traveled straight up through the club like hitting reinforced steel. His forearm tingled unpleasantly. Still, he had hurt Brahm. Struck a blow that actually damaged the massive tortoise in front of him. Cade swallowed and forced his voice steady. "We can stop here," he called out. "You go your way. I go mine. No hard feelings." Brahm's head lifted slowly. The tortoise pushed himself upright with slow, deliberate movements. He was breathing heavier than before. Cade's eyes flicked to the seam on Brahm's flank. There was a visible fracture in the tortoise's armored shell. Brahm's mouth curled upward. "Looks like the mutated freak has some fight in him after all," he rumbled. His ember eyes burned brighter. "I suppose I must get serious." Cade's stomach tightened. He wasn't fighting seriously before? Brahm inhaled sharply and Cade braced for another torrent of white flame. But the fire did not come. Instead, something else moved. White ash, fine and powdery, began to lift from the burning 9th root pillar behind them. The air filled with drifting particulates that swirled unnaturally toward Brahm as though pulled by invisible currents. The ash spiraled around him in a tightening vortex. Cade stepped back instinctively. The ash condensed, swirling faster, then funneled inward, vacuumed directly into the tortoise's flared nostrils as he inhaled deeply. He watched in stunned silence. As the ash disappeared into Brahm, the crack along his left flank began to glow. White light seeped into the fracture like molten resin filling a mold. Brahm inhaled again. The remaining ash in the hollow was stripped from the air and drawn into him. When the last fleck vanished, the glow faded. The seam was smooth. Unbroken, as if Cade had never struck it at all. Brahm exhaled slowly, smoke trailing from his nostrils. "The path of desolation does not merely destroy," he said calmly. Cade stared, mouth agape at what he had just witnessed. For a heartbeat, the hollow seemed to tilt sideways. He had seen something very similar before. The Ashen Emperor. When he had first arrived in Cynthia's legacy, dropped into the ashen wastes like discarded meat. He had thought the storm on the horizon was just wind and sand. But it hadn't been sand, it was ash. And at the center of that ash storm had been the Emperor. Cade could still picture it, the colossal worm writhing beneath a sky of white particulate, the Emperor's bleach-white flame incinerating it in an instant, burning flesh, plate, and hide down to nothing but fine powder. And then the ash had moved. It had flowed inward, drawn back toward the eye of the storm. He hadn't been able to see clearly through the blizzard of white, but now he understood. The Emperor hadn't merely destroyed. It had consumed the ash, using it to nourish its own body. Just like Brahm had done. The crack Cade had fought so hard to make was gone as though it had never existed. Brahm rolled his shoulders slowly, then he charged again. Cade planted his feet and raised the cracked shell. Brahm's fist came in faster than before, trading brute force for a quicker strike with more precision. Even with hyper-focused meditation active, Cade barely tracked it in time. The punch slammed into the shell and a loud crack split the air. The shield was pushed back and smacked against Cade's chest, knocking the breath from him, but he didn't go airborne this time. He held his ground. Another punch followed. And another. And another. Each strike spiderwebbed fractures farther across the shell. The dull pearlescent surface splintered visibly, lines racing across it like lightning. Cade's arms trembled under the barrage. He could feel how controlled Brahm's blows were now. Not the overwhelming hammer strikes from before, but surgical impacts designed to break the shield without overcommitting. If you hide behind a stolen shell, Brahm taunted between blows, I will simply break it and carve out your soft flesh beneath. Cade ducked the next punch, angling the shell upwards so the blow skittered off the cracked surface instead of smashing straight through. The deflection shifted Brahm's weight forward just enough for Cade to make his move. He dropped the shield slightly and swung the club in a tight, brutal arc at Brahm's exposed leg. The wooden head connected squarely with the tortoise's knee joint. There was a sickening pop as Brahm's leg buckled. The massive body pitched forward under its own weight and momentum. As he fell, Brahm lunged for Cade, claws grabbing for the shield. Cade reacted on instinct and let go. Rather than risk being dragged into a grappling match with something twice his mass and 3 times his strength, he slipped his hand free of the bony protrusion and abandoned the shell entirely. Brahm crashed down onto it. The already fractured shell exploded into dull, pearlescent fragments beneath the tortoise's bulk. Cade staggered back, now empty-handed on his left side. His shield was gone. Broken beyond recovery. The one item he had since entering this corrupted dungeon had broken under the impact of the falling tortoise. But Cade didn't have time to mourn the loss of his shield. He needed to take advantage of the now prone tortoise. He pivoted hard to the right, circling the prone tortoise. If the destroyer couldn't stand, it couldn't charge. If it couldn't charge, it couldn't bring that monstrous strength to bear, and Cade could get away. Disable the legs, he thought. End its mobility and I can get out alive. He gripped the club with both hands and swung in a brutal arc, aiming high on Brahm's exposed thigh. The wooden head connected with a heavy crack, but the sound wasn't right. The impact shuddered up Cade's arms and he realized the crack hadn't come from bone breaking. A long fissure split down the length of the dark wooden club. His weapon was failing, but that didn't stop Cade's assault. Gripping the weakening club with both hands, Cade raised it overhead and brought it down again with everything he had, targeting the same leg. This time the impact felt different. The club shattered. Splinters exploded outward in a spray of dark wood as the weapon exploded against Brahm's limb. Fragments scattered across the scorched ground. Brahm bellowed in genuine pain. Then, to Cade's surprise, the massive tortoise withdrew into its shell. Brahm's limbs retracted with shocking speed. Head tucked in. The thick neck vanished behind overlapping plates as Brahm sealed himself inside his shell. Cade's chest heaved as adrenaline flooded his veins. And yet, in this brief moment, he found himself smiling. The expression startled him. He was outmatched. Facing something that could heal itself by inhaling ash and burn him to cinders with white flames. And yet, he was smiling. Because this was exhilarating. The back and forth. The split-second decisions. The puzzle of reading Brahm's movements and finding the single opening in a wall of overwhelming power. This wasn't like being hunted. This was a contest. A violent, lethal contest, but a contest all the same. Part of him screamed to run. Now was his chance. Brahm was literally turtled up inside his shell, temporarily immobile. Cade could sprint for the mists and vanish before the destroyer had a chance to once again reset the fight. But another part of him, the part that had surged forward in the crucible, that had grinned when the first crack appeared in Brahm's flank, didn't want to run. If Brahm wanted Cade's essence. If Brahm wanted to turn Cade and Pearl into kindling for his path. Why shouldn't Cade treat him the same way? Cade inhaled sharply and reached inward. He felt the rhizome again, tiny tendrils writhing beneath his skin, coiling through his unseen pathways. He willed them downward, guiding the gathering pull toward his right palm. The increasingly familiar drain began again, but he pushed through it as wood erupted from his palm once more. Dark heartwood spilled outward, thickening and shaping itself in less than 2 heartbeats. It solidified into another club, denser this time, heavier, the bulbous head slightly larger, the grip again molded perfectly to his hand. His vision dimmed faintly at the edges from the cost, but it was worth it to have a weapon again. Cade stepped forward. The tortoise's shell loomed in front of him. Its armored form was nearly impenetrable except at the seams. He raised the club high. Then brought it diagonally down with savage force toward the junction where the front and back plates met.